One of the most shocking and brutal executions saw Elizabeth I sign off on the execution of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary had been a constant thorn in the side of the Tudor Queen for some time, and she did get involved in a number of plots to oust Elizabeth from the throne, and with this the English Queen and her council had enough, and they ordered the death of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary herself had a rather tragic and turbulent life, and her end was just a cherry on the cake. She would be married a number of times, but each of these marriages was disturbing in itself. She married the young King of France, who died at a young age, then married a man who would be assassinated and allegedly blown up whilst he slept. But then her third husband was a man who treated her awfully and forced the Queen to marry him, but he was also accused of murdering Mary's second husband. But following her execution, Mary Queen of Scots' story was not over, and she was a queen who would be buried twice, and her remains were not treated with dignity or respect until decades later. Join us today as we look at opening the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The plot that secured the execution of Mary Queen of Scots was known as the Babington Plot, and Mary had been held a prisoner of the English Queen for almost 2 decades. She was kept in a varying degree of comfort, but she continued to try and scheme to get her way out of her incarceration and house arrest. She agreed to take part in the plot, which would have seen Elizabeth I killed, and then Mary being made the English Queen, and many Catholics across the country backed this. However, Mary would then be sentenced to death, and her execution was arranged to take place inside of Fotheringhay Castle, where she was held. She was told the day before the axe fell that she would be executed the next day, and she spent her final hours getting her affairs in order, but her execution would not go well. She was not executed with a single strike of the axe, and the first blow when she knelt on the scaffold and lay her head on the block missed and hit the back of her head. The axe embedded in the back of her skull, and this blow may have killed Mary, but the job was not done. A second swing was used and the executioner struck the neck, and it almost severed her head from her body, but for a piece of sinew, which was then sawn through by the axeman. He then picked her head up and showed it to the crowd and said, "God save the Queen," as the gasps inside the Great Hall of Fotheringhay could be heard. But when the executioner held the head up, Mary's wig slipped and it came loose, and with this her head fell onto the floor, and it showed that Mary had short grey hair. But then the decision was made to make sure there was a huge clean-up operation, as anything that was touched by the blood of Mary was thrown into the fire of the Great Hall, and even the block and the scaffold were taken down and thrown into the fire as wood. All of Mary's clothes were also burned, and this stopped Catholics collecting relics from Mary. However, Elizabeth I would regret the execution of Mary Queen of Scots until the day she would die, and she believed that her actions in ordering and signing off the death of another anointed queen would prevent her getting into heaven, and bishops on her deathbed promised the English Queen that this would not stop her. She would believe that her Privy Council had convinced her to do this without her own decision, and she threw one of her advisers in the Tower of London for his advice and counsel with regards to Mary. However, Mary Queen of Scots gave a number of strict and important instructions as to what she would like to be done with her body and remains following her death, and she informed people that she wanted to be sent to France following her death, and that she wanted her body to be laid to rest with her first husband, the King of France, who had died many years before. However, Elizabeth I would not allow this to happen, and she refused Mary this final request, possibly as it would have been too high profile and costly to send her remains across the English Channel, and she feared a Catholic uprising. Because of this, there was a significant amount of debate internally within the royal circles as to what to do with the remains of Mary Queen of Scots. In the days after her execution, her body was placed inside of a lead-lined coffin, and it was left inside of a presence chamber and a side room inside Fotheringhay Castle, and because of this they were simply left to rot. But her remains had been embalmed also by doctors, and Mary's heart and entrails, it's believed, were removed from her body, and these were then buried nearby inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, encased inside of a lead casket. But then these remains were left inside of the room for many months, and her body was unburied for some time. But Elizabeth would not consent to the burial plans, and constant debate remained as to where to bury Mary. Then the final decision was made to bury her inside of Peterborough Cathedral, which was the closest cathedral to the site of her execution, and where she was currently lying in the coffin. The decision to move her coffin took place, and there was a procession from Fotheringhay to Peterborough, and this burial register inside of the cathedral would state, "The Queen of Scots was most sumptuously buried in the Cathedral Church of Peterborough the 1st day of August 1587, who was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle the 8th of February before." The heralds and officers of Queen Elizabeth I's household arrived a few weeks before, and deliberately chose the burial site to be underneath the floor opposite the body of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was also a staunch Catholic and a fierce queen. For the funeral procession, there was a large hearse which arrived from Fotheringhay, and this was pulled by horses who were draped in black cloth, and the cathedral was also decorated with black cloth, and this would have cost a significant amount of money to bury Mary. On the 30th of July between 1 and 2 a.m. in 1587, the body of Mary Queen of Scots was brought from Fotheringhay Castle under a procession of torches lighting the way, and the body was placed on a chariot. Mary's friends and members of her household were part of this procession, as was the Bishop and Dean of Peterborough, and when her body got to the cathedral, it was placed in the burial site near to the high altar. But this was of course not what Mary Queen of Scots wanted, and to rub salt into the wounds, Mary's funeral service was carried out in the Protestant way, not adhering to the Catholic beliefs that Mary possessed. She was also not allowed to be buried where she wanted. But in 1603, Elizabeth I died, and then Mary's son James came onto the throne of England, despite the fact he was also the Scottish king. James I, as he was known then, drew up plans to allow his mother to be given a dignified burial, and one which marked her significant place in history. The plans were drafted quickly, but then in 1612, Mary Queen of Scots would be reburied in a huge tomb, which had taken 6 long years to finish. Her remains were dug up inside of Peterborough Cathedral, and she was unearthed from the ground by gravediggers, and they lifted the body from the vault, and then her body was then taken to Westminster Abbey on yet again another grand procession. The king granted a royal warrant for the burial of his mother, and James I's huge marble tomb for his mother was placed on the south side of the Lady Chapel, the huge mausoleum for the Tudor kings and queens, inside of Westminster Abbey. The tomb in effigy shows Mary wearing a close-fitting, dignified coif, with a lace ruff, and a crowned Scottish lion can be found at her feet. She was buried straight opposite Elizabeth I also, signifying their rivalry, even in death. But Mary's tomb is larger than Elizabeth's, and this was made deliberately. However, this was not the last time that the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was disturbed. Her coffin, following the reburial ceremony, was placed inside of a vault, and then for 2 centuries she was laid to rest. However, at some point there was a significant amount of breaking into the vault of Mary and her tomb. Arthur P. Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, was a curious man, and he wanted to find the coffin of King James I, Mary's son, as the remains of this king had been lost to time. Queen Victoria allowed him to carry out searches of the royal vaults, and he then documented what he saw in a completely different light, and Stanley's accounts are the last written descriptions of the coffins we have. James I would be found interred in the same vault as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but there was a rumour that his body had been buried in the same vault as his mother's coffin, and Stanley, to confirm this or deny it, broke into the vault of Mary Queen of Scots. He found the tomb and coffin of Mary, and Mary's lead coffin had been placed along the north wall of the vault, and Mary was not on her own in this large vault. There were many other burials inside of it, but the tomb of Mary and her vault had been broken in a number of times to bury further members of the royal family. The coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was found underneath the coffin of Lady Arbella Stuart, which is strange considering she was buried underneath Arbella. And in the vault was also Anne Hyde, the Duchess of York, Henry the Prince of Wales, Elizabeth the Winter Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and many of James II's children. These were many descendants of the Stuart dynasty, and these were direct descendants in a sense of Mary Queen of Scots, but after Stanley had looked at the coffin of Mary and the others, the vault was sealed up, and it's not believed to have been entered since this day. The coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was moved a number of times over the centuries, and she was even exhumed and was then buried 100 miles away from her initial site of burial. But following the large ceremony inside of Westminster Abbey, she was interred under a huge tomb, which was befitting of her role and status in history, and it did cement that she was a queen. However, this vault containing her coffin would be broken into a number of times in the centuries after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.